Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Kristen Walker-Painemilla, and I am chair of the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economics, and Social Policy. We are pleased to have you all here today to gather for our fifth virtual dialogue looking at building back better. And we're looking at the impacts of COVID on gender. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping. One, I would love people as they come on to let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat. And we'll continue to remind people to do that as we go through. We also have interpretation. So if Spanish and English, if you want to listen in either language, you can go to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and choose your language. Tenemos interpretación en español, en inglés. Si quieres escuchar en español, por favor, aprieta el botón de interpretación y puedes escoger su idioma. Today, we have a great session made up of 6 panelists that you'll hear from a diverse set of experiences looking at global issues related to gender, looking at what is happening in the field, and what have the impacts of COVID been. I am going to pass the baton to my colleague Meher Nashawani, who is the Regional Vice Chair for Asia, and also for CISP, and also Chair of the Specialist Group on Gender. Meher is also a candidate for Regional Counselor for IUCN in the upcoming IUCN Congress as well. Meher, I will pass it to you, and then you all see me towards the end to help moderate the Q&A. Should you have any questions during this time, please include your questions within the Q&A button and we will bring them up at the end. But as you're hearing things, please, and you have a question, put it in there so you don't forget. Meher, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to all our panelists and all of you who have joined us today. I want to begin this by providing a brief overview and the context of this webinar on gender and the main issues we are going to try and address today. It's an important webinar, and it is one in a series of virtual dialogues hosted by CISP, which will focus on issues related to gender and the impact of COVID-19. As we know, it's been a very difficult year, and the pandemic has spread around the world, killing hundreds of thousands of people and affecting millions. We are seeing the direct impact on health and well-being of communities and nature worldwide. Many of the issues arising are issues that are core to the work of IUCN and CISP. And while we are still unclear of the pathway towards the World Conservation Congress, CISP has embarked on a series of virtual dialogues that will look at how to build back better. I'd like to put this into the context of IUCN, the Commission, and the Specialist Group on Gender, and then move on to the issues. In the context of IUCN, the IUCN statement on COVID-19 states, it is clear that the COVID-19 outbreak is also bringing new threats to Indigenous people, rural communities, and has intensified violence, in particular against girls and women, as quarantine conditions make unsafe homes even more dangerous. This crisis, especially one of this intensity, raises difficult questions. And other issues which go beyond the human tragedy are about humanity's relationship with the natural world and the impact of our activities. As we know, the WCC has been postponed, and the pandemic has led to new challenges in ways of thinking, living, adapting, and coping to a different way of life. CISP supports IUCN's mission through its mandate and generates and harmonizes knowledge, promotes actions to harmonize the conservation of nature, the critical social, cultural, environmental, and economic justice concerns of human societies. That is what we are looking at today. It is in this context that CISP is hosting these dialogues to understand and explore the critical emerging issues that we are currently facing. Within the Commission, the Specialist Group on Gender has 64 gender specialists from across the IUCN regions who focus on gender equality and conservation, and work to strengthen the understanding of and promote the full achievement of gender equality and women's empowerment and conservation and sustainable development in all policy and practice. And some of the members of our group are here today, and I thank them for their support in this dialogue. In terms of the main issues, over the last few months, we have heard of several issues related to women, the gendered impact of COVID-19, which is still being explored. Information, emerging facts need to be examined in detail, and a greater understanding is required based on evidence from different countries, from urban and rural areas, from communities, to be able to generate facts to build better response when we eventually emerge from the pandemic. Therefore, in terms of the current crisis, we must begin to understand the global and local situation in relation to gender, as information from across the world has described the situation for women having almost overnight lost the incremental gains that have been made in recent times towards improving issues of inequality, opportunity to increase agency through access to education, healthcare, livelihoods, and financial independence. For men, it has also led to an increased level of stress in terms of financial insecurity, loss of jobs, and the impact on personal finances such as house rent and loans. At the same time, Indigenous people are also voicing urgent concerns about the elevated health risks and exposure faced by their communities. Gaps in access to adequate health infrastructure, clean water, food security, and economic stability are all pressing issues. And so the impact varies by country. And how has the crisis been handled from a governmental response and the prevalence of the disease within the country? Just to give a brief focus on Pakistan, which is where I am now based and where I'm speaking from. In Pakistan, this pandemic has compounded pre-existing gender inequalities. The spread of COVID-19 and the lockdowns have had a dramatic effect on the well-being of families and communities, particularly women and children. A recent study launched only a few days ago has indicated that the lack of emergency services has increased issues of access and relief for women and girls in reproductive health, gender-based violence, education, and economic resilience. So women face considerable threats to their economic, physical, legal, and social security. Also, for women in terms of the loss of livelihoods, the livelihoods of many women have been disrupted and lost. Domestic workers, home-based workers, informal sector, all this has been affected. And in the formal sector, school teachers and support staff have lost their jobs or their salaries have been reduced. For the most vulnerable families, loss in income due to this outbreak has resulted in poverty, acute psychological stress, increased vulnerability for women and children to violence, and a reduced healthcare for non-COVID-19 matters. And that is an important issue because access to hospitals is less than it used to be before. We've also heard that there is an increase in the prevalence of gender-based violence in the home, and that the burden of work related to women's reproductive and domestic responsibilities has increased, leading to increased exhaustion and more susceptibility to disease. As the crisis continues, access to and benefits from natural resources may also become increasingly scarce, worsening economic stress and food insecurity. Regular natural disasters like rain and floods are compounded by the fallout of the pandemic. In other regions of the world, recent research on gender-based violence, which we will hear more of today, also reveals that home quarantine measures have enabled the common tools of abuse, which include isolation from friends and other support networks, family and employment, constant surveillance, strict detailed rules for behavior, and restrictions to basic necessities and resources, such as food and sanitary facilities, make it harder and more difficult for women to manage their home, families, and livelihoods while we're living in this crisis. During the pandemic, physical proximity and limited legal services impact the ability of victims to seek help. In addition, safe houses and shelters have reduced capacities due to social distancing measures, and support networks and social services are limited in their ability to visit or work with people experiencing violence as resources are diverted to deal with the health crisis. Today's dialogue will allow us to discuss issues of inequality, gender-based violence, and environmental resource dependency to enable us to see the impact within communities and households. The representation of voices of women from rural communities on this issue has been relatively neglected in the transition to holding conversations online and on digital platforms. This webinar would like to bring them back into the mainstream. Our speakers today are from different regions of the world: Mexico, United States, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And we will hear their perspectives on this important issue. I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Itza Castellina Came, who is the IUCN Gender Advisor in Mexico. And to give a brief introduction, Itza, welcome, and I'm glad you're here with us today. Itza is a biologist, and with a master's degree in environment and integrated development. In 2019, Itza is a member of the Gender Task Force International Panel on Climate Change, and since 1995 is a member of the Gender and Environment Network of Mexico. She has also served as Senior Gender Advisor to the UNDP program in Mexico. She has advised on several gender programs in climate change, disaster risk reduction, environment, and gender-based violence. She is current consultant on gender and sustainable development by UCN and other development agencies. She's the co-author of several books on gender, natural protected areas, climate change, and gender-based violence. Welcome, Itza, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Buenos días a quienes están en América Latina. It's a real pleasure being in this webinar. Thank you for considering us. And I can't see my presentation. I don't know if I can see
Here
it.
it comes. It's on the screen now.
I can't see it. Let me see.
You can see.
Yes. Yes. So Meher has made a great introduction to the topic, and I will try to focus on different issues that are impacting and are involved in the crisis, because it's not just the pandemic crisis. When the pandemic came, we were already in different type of crises. One of them was the environmental crisis, the climate change crisis, and it is not an addition. Pandemic is not adding to those crises. We have to see those crises in a more complex equation, and that's what we are trying to see and to share with you. So I'm going to start. Next, please. Okay, I'm going to share with you what do we know at the moment about gender-based violence and environment. Then how is COVID impacting gender-based violence and environment linkages? And we will finish saying what can we do, what we have identified that we can do in the context of environmental and conservation work. Next, please. What do we know? Next. IUCN has developed this document in English, in Spanish, and will be translated into French about gender-based violence and environment linkages. And we have found that rooted in discriminatory gender norms and laws, gender-based violence occurs in all societies as a means of control, subjugation, and exploitation. And it occurs in different levels, and not only to women, it occurs in men, in children, in women, of course. Gender-based and abuse are observed across environmental context. For this document, we made a survey and we made a call for case studies, and we documented that this type of violence is affecting the security and well-being of nations, of communities and individuals. And also it's impacting the achievement of the development goals. We have documented that many of the respondents of the survey have observed gender-based violence, but they also share with us that it was not being addressed in their programs and projects, and that they need tools, that they need to know how to address this violence that they are observing in environmental projects. So this is about this publication. We invite you to read it. And this is part of what we know now. Next, por favor, please. We also have developed other tools. At the beginning of the pandemic, we developed an information note on gender-based violence and environment linkages. And now we have developed a second edition. This second edition was prepared, of course, with the IUCN Global Program on Governance and Rights, the first also. And this provides an overview information for promoting awareness among environmental organizations on how gender-based violence and environment linkages can be impacted by COVID. I'm going to talk about this second information note in these minutes that I have. So we here are bringing together, the latest evidence that we could collect, examples for action and recommendations. It includes environment relevant examples for across 5 main themes. And I'm going to try to share with you which are these themes. So now the second part of my presentation is how COVID is impacting gender-based violence and environment linkages. And the theme 1 is, of course, women and girls at home. It has been worldwide documented that gender-based violence is increasing during the pandemic. It has increased exponentially, not only because of the lockdown, because they are responsible for water, food collection, food preparation, and now they are taking care of children as well of the elderly and ill relatives. And they are now teachers, they are now etc. And they have lost their jobs. Many women that were in the informal work have they lost their jobs. So home quarantines, market impacts, and food shortages has increased household tensions and result in domestic violence. In the field, we also found that, for example, fisheries, the fishery sector has been impacted because of the close of markets. Some food markets have also been closed, and many women, as we know, work in those sectors. So there is a regression in women's empowerment. There is reduced income and greater workload, increased tensions, and that gives more opportunity to violence. Next, please. The second theme that we have addressed in this note is the impacts on livelihoods and labor. For example, the loss of employment, as Meher has said, can often result in men overtaking subsistence and income generating activities that are typically conducted by women. Scarcity can contribute to an increase in exploitative transactional survival sex. We have documented this terrible situation of transactional sex in terms to obtain food, not only food for sex, fish for sex. In Latin America, in Africa, it has been documented that this terrible form of gender-based violence is increasing during the pandemic. So also another impact of the pandemic is the migrant workers from cities to the villages. Now they are migrating from the urban areas to the rural areas, where both the possibility of transmission and domestic violence can increase. And also we have observed in Mexico, for example, that the organized crime is using this and also is applying some violence, not only gender-based violence, but violence in the rural areas. So This has also impacted the caregiving and household duties and limiting women's ability to do paid work as well as volunteer work. So this also is impacting conservation. This is also impacting participation in some projects. And here is where we need to be very proactive and creative, not only to stop gender-based violence, but to understand how are we going to work with this population, with women that are not only losing their jobs, suffering gender-based violence, losing employment, and cannot participate in the same way in the conservation and development programs and projects. Second, please. Third, climate change. It has also been documented that when the pandemic arose, the climate change crisis was also arising. In previous documentations, for example, in this infographic, we can see that after tropical cyclones in Vanuatu, there were 300% more new cases of domestic violence. In the recent floods and in the recent hurricanes in Central America, it has been also documented increase in new cases of domestic violence, but not only domestic violence. People from those regions that are suffering climate impacts, climate-related impacts and migration are seeing that in the shelters, gender-based violence is increasing, and now is more complicated because they need to obtain water in the shelters, and girls and women are in charge of getting that water and firewood to the shelters, and they are more exposed to gender-based violence. So in this theme of gender-based violence and climate change crisis, we have also seen in the previously that in drought, increased resource insecurity due to the pandemic may lead to a rise on child marriage, to gain, breed, wealth, or lessen food needs within a family. This has been documented. This is terrible. Child marriage is growing during the pandemic. On Friday, UNICEF showed a report about this issue, and it is terrible. The situation is getting worse. So this is one of the SDGs that they are saying is not going to be achieved with related to climate change. It was previous, we have documented that in the document that I was saying at the beginning, but it also now is combined and getting worse with the pandemic situation. Next, please. Sexual exploitation. It is often the case in weather-related disasters context also that sexual exploitation and abuse may increase in relation to accessing and controlling pandemic response services and resources to COVID basic needs. We have documented in different countries abuse from the government, from the army. We have also documented that now that they are suffering scarcity of food, they have been experiencing sexual exploitation and abuse because they are managing this as a control to give them food and water. Of course, this is a worse violation of human rights. Next, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have just a few more seconds left.
Okay, so I'm going to. And theme 4, that it has been addressed in a previous webinar of IUCN, is about environmental human rights defenders, and it has increased violence against these defenders. I will go quickly to the what can we do. The first recommendation is be ready to respond to gender-based violence when it happens. We need to be prepared, but we also respond. We cannot just see as it happens, and we have to document. We need to document and to make the cases of what we are observing in our projects, in our programs related to conservation and development. Next. Need to address as a main part of environmental programming, ensure that we are programming with this focus. We cannot say this is not our problem. Yes, it is, and we need to address it. We need to be gender responsive. It means that while we address conservation and development, we need to address and reduce gender inequalities and gender-based violence. Next. Prevent. We also documented in this research that there could be unintended exacerbation of gender-based violence. So we need to prevent this, and we need to improve gender responsive institutional policies to address gender-based violence. We have in IUCN a gender policy. We have a gender tools. So we do not have any excuse to do not address these issues in our programs and projects. Next. Actions. Of course, we need to build capacity. We need the support of experts. We need to work with experts on these issues. We need tools. We need to put budget and, of course, data and information, and work with the institutions that are in charge of gender-based violence. We need to develop our own policy development and the project development, policy development, and gender action plans and gender-based violence action plans. And of course, the main issue for us, the main challenge is coordination with women, with civil society, and with donors. So I will stop here. I will just want to let you know that at IUCN, we are creating a new knowledge platform. It's on gender-based violence and environment. It's Gender-Based Violence and Environment Center. And we are trying to get the attention to tackle these issues, to learn, to act, and to create the change. We invite you to visit this new platform and be part of this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isa. Thank you very much. And I know we'll have lots of questions on your presentation. It's very informative and interesting, and also very relevant to the theme today. The next speaker is Kame Westerman. She is Senior Gender Advisor at Conservation International. And Kame works closely with field-based colleagues to support practical ways for integrating gender considerations into conservation initiatives. Kame, it's a pleasure to have you today. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Meher. And thank you, Itza, for setting this up so nicely. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, you know, I think Meher and Itza have really set the stage for why gender-based violence is so important in the context of COVID-19 and, of course, in the context of the environment. But I think despite the really robust research that IUCN has done and the very sort of groundbreaking report that came out last year, there's still a lot of questions, I think, from conservation practitioners about what do we actually do. So Itza started to indicate that towards the end of her presentation. But at Conservation International, where we work with local communities around the world, and have many field-based conservation practitioners, there's a real question about, okay, well, how do we take this research and this big body of knowledge and actually prepare our staff, our colleagues, and our partners for when we're in that sort of situation. And I think too, there's also the question about what is conservation sector's role, responsibility, obligation with respect to gender-based violence? So clearly there's a connection, but what is our actual role? And we often work at that last mile. We work in very remote areas where traditional gender-based violence services such as clinics and even police and other support services don't reach. And so it really often puts our colleagues who are working in the field in a very unique and challenging situation where they are sort of the trusted partner and the place where many community members might feel comfortable going to report an incident. And this is exactly what we're hearing from colleagues around the world. So I've worked closely with colleagues in about 20 different countries, and nearly all of them have indicated gender-based violence is something that they've either witnessed or they've heard reports about. And they're really struggling with what is their role and what do they do. I do also want to mention too that I think there is still some hesitation in the conservation community about where our role sort of begins and ends. And some may even say that it's outside the scope of conservation. We're conservationists, we measure trees, we protect protected areas and that sort of thing. And gender-based violence is sticky. It's a challenging issue to work around. But ignoring it or simply saying it's outside of our scope is no longer acceptable. So, at Conservation International, we're very much concerned about gender-based violence for these reasons. It's a fundamental abuse of human rights. It's a barrier to achieving our program goals, our conservation and human well-being program goals. We recognize that it can be an unintended program effect if we're not clear and proactive about understanding gender-based violence during program or project design. And we're also concerned about it in the context of personal safety and health of our project staff who are in these areas and find themselves confronted with reports or incidences of gender-based violence. I also want to mention too that so in addition to this great body of research that IUCN collected, in addition to this being, sort of a moral argument for why we need to be concerned about gender-based violence, and a conservation argument in the sense that we can't achieve our conservation goals without also recognizing and addressing gender-based violence, there's also donors that are starting to recognize this as well. So the Global Environment Fund now has gender-based violence in their environmental and social screening form. The Green Climate Fund now is starting to look at sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment as part of the overall operations. And we're also seeing a number of bilateral donors, governments, that are starting to ask about gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So the donors are also wanting to see more robust and comprehensive addressing of this issue. So again, this is really, when I talk with my colleagues in the field, these are the questions that they're really wondering. What is CI's role and obligation in these situations? What should CI staff be prepared for? How can they be prepared? And how do we make sure not to perpetuate gender-based violence? And so as colleagues were starting to come to me with these questions, and really several of them came to us, to the gender program, with real life examples of things that they're seeing. And this is obviously increasing because of COVID, but they're really struggling with what they should do. And so we first looked for gender-based violence guidelines. So there must be something out there that someone has produced that would be suitable to help guide field-based conservation practitioners. And there are certainly a lot of gender-based violence guidelines out there, but they're all quite long, and most of them are focused on the health sector or even like the education sector. There's really nothing focused on the environment, and many of them seem to be also focused on, again, areas that had some sort of formal support service, formal GBV support service. They weren't necessarily focused on, support for people who were really the only support service in a community. So we did a wide desk review of gender-based violence guidelines. We also did a number of expert interviews with GBV experts, trying to understand, what's the best practice right now in 2020 for addressing gender-based violence in very remote areas. What do we do? And then we also did a number of external and internal consultations, and we developed our own guidelines. Again, recognizing this dearth of existing guidelines. And the guidelines are, again, very much focused on users who are not gender-based violence experts, not even gender experts, but people who are working closely in communities, who are approached by community members with issues. And like Itza was saying, we just want to make sure that our staff are prepared, because we've had many instances where maybe somebody's having a focus group with women about how they're fishing in the mangroves. And all of a sudden, the safe space that CI has created to talk about mangrove fishing has turned into a safe space where women are sharing some really difficult issues that they're having. And our staff have felt unprepared in the past for when that arises. And so we wanted to, again, put together some guidance on how do you be prepared? How do you know what to do when someone comes to you? And really start to get at that question of like, where does the CI field-based practitioner's role begin and end? Again, recognizing that we're not first responders, we don't want to be in that role of first responders, but we need to be, we also can't just ignore what's happening. So I can share these guidelines in the chat box, but real quick, these are some of the key messages, and they sort of reiterate what Itza also mentioned. But first of all, just learning about gender-based violence and gender norms as part of project design. So just asking the question, is in this particular area where this project is going to happen, is gender-based violence higher, lower than the national average or the regional average? Why might that be? What are some of those gender norms? Obviously, we know that gender-based violence manifests in areas that have high gender inequality. Giving basic gender-based violence training for all project staff. So, we try to already do gender training, but integrating gender-based violence as a component of gender training as well, particularly in those projects that might be higher risk. Create and find a referral list. So this is, again, the idea that we are not first responders. We never will be first responders, but having a list of both formal and informal services or places that we can sort of refer somebody to is a good place for us to be. That's sort of the role that CI can play. So obviously formal services, like I mentioned before, would be like clinics and the police or authorities, local authorities, any sort of psychosocial support or child support services. Obviously, in many places where I work, that's not even, that's not relevant. And so it's those informal support services that we also need to identify. Those trusted community leaders, both men and women, women's organizations, other NGOs that might be working in the area, local or international. And having that list of services ready before you're even approached by somebody is important. Obviously, engaging men and gatekeepers in the community. There's, obviously evidence that shows that when women, particularly in projects that increase economic income, livelihood income, there can be increased gender-based violence because of that. And so in all of the projects, especially those where they're very much focused just on women, women's leadership, women's economic empowerment, making sure to not just focus on women, but to focus and engage all members of the community so that there is more buy-in and there's no backlash. Including the tracking of gender-based violence-related incidences or norms within the monitoring and evaluation plan. So again, in those projects that might be more higher risk for gender-based violence, making sure that there is a way to track whether the project is impacting or influencing additional gender-based violence. So that could be through the project grievance mechanism. It could be through ongoing monitoring and just informal discussions with folks in the community. And then finally, creating a protocol for dealing with gender-based violence. So say you work in a field program and you hear of someone comes to you with a report. What do you do with that report? Does it stay with you? Who do you need to report it to within the field program? Or does it need to be reported to authorities? And so having that protocol laid out beforehand will make the response much easier. So with that, I think that's my last slide. So I'm gonna leave it there. Again, I'll put the guidelines into the chat box. These guidelines, of course, are global in nature. And so they're very much, the idea is very much that field teams and anyone who's using these would adapt them for local use, of course. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing to sort of the reality of the ground root, the grassroots, working on very sensitive issues of gender-based violence, how difficult they are in reality. So thank you for that, and thank you for giving us some tools to be able to respond to those as well. Our next speaker is Mahfooza Akhtar Mala, who is the Program Coordinator, Gender Justice and Social Inclusion Program in Oxfam, Bangladesh. Mala has a master's in anthropology and 10 years field experience in women's rights and gender justice. She is working on a gender justice inclusion program with a focus on protection of women and girls. She has vast experience on women's resilience and works to increase community resilience to disasters through improved awareness, leadership, and capacity to monitor and assess current and future responses and to hold governments to account. Welcome, Mala, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Meher. Thank you, IUCN, for organizing such important discussion, which is very contemporary issues. And I also thanks my fellow speaker for highlighting the impact of COVID in relation to gender. So this actually helps me a lot to carry forward the discussion from this ground. So thanks everyone. So in this time of compounding global crisis, what we realize that we all have to come together, not just to fight with COVID pandemic, but also to preserve our commitment that we already had towards certain shared beliefs. And what I believe that gender justice and ending violence against women is one of the most important issues that we all have to consider even more into this humanitarian crisis, because we all know that any kind of disaster, during any kind of disaster, women and children becomes 14 times more vulnerable. And this COVID has shows that how the pandemic has impacted disproportionately on different gender groups, different ethnic groups, disability and socioeconomic social class, and even more the different age group. So when we are talking about the gender impact, we also have to consider the impact on the man also. But many of us has we are comfortable to speak about the impact of women, but during this pandemic, what we observed that millions and millions peoples they lost their livelihood, and a majority of them are men. So we also have to recognize the impact of COVID on men also, and this also created some mental pressure on men, which also resulting some violence against women. So even though in Bangladesh we have seen that the COVID impact, the infection rate, according to our government data, the infection rate is higher on the man, which is comparatively lower. Only 29% women get infected by the COVID-19, even though due to social construction, due to our gender construction, women are, even though they are less infected, but they are more vulnerable compared to men, because of the social norms and values that we have in our especially South Asian cultural settings. There are numbers of study conducted by numbers of agencies in Bangladesh. Uh, um, for example, one of the national NGOs, I know Shalish Kendo, they have conducted a research recently which says that of, like during the COVID, last 9 months, around 975 women, they experience rape incidents, and among them more than 200 were gang rape. So even though the numbers is increasing compared to the peace hour, but our referral system is not functional. Women are not getting their justice because of the limited access to the government services. Like our women are not, they don't have access to the health services. They don't have access to the one-stop crisis center that restricted women to get the medical legal, because in Bangladesh, once women faced rape incidents, she has to done the medical legal within 24 hours. But due to this, the health services is not available, it is not possible for her to get the medical legal within the timeline. So this is also like a very barrier to get justice in such rape incidents. And also like our other services like police station or our referral system is not functional. So women are also having some difficulties to have the regular health services, our antenatal care or services during delivery or servicing post delivery. These are not available right now. And even though due to economic meltdown, many families are having financial crises. So this is also something that, since our contraceptive pills or family planning supports are not properly provided by the government, women are, they have less access to contraceptive pills, and this is also increasing the rate of pregnancy, but we are not getting any delivery related services from the health sector. So this is very challenging. And there are also some evidences that shows that due to food crises, women have to considering the cultural construction, they have less food intake. This is also resulted like malnutrition for women and malnutrition for the newborn babies. So the overall situations is become very hostile for women, because they are already marginalized. So what the COVID has done, the existing inequality we have, the COVID has fueled it more. The burden is now double or tripled, but our services are not available. Even the before pandemic, there are challenges to get those services, but these challenges become more critical for women after the COVID situations. And in Bangladesh, countries like Bangladesh, where we are also prone to disaster, like climate-induced disaster. So during this lockdown, last 9 months, we also have experienced multiple numbers of climate-induced disasters. So whenever we are talking about the impact, disaster impact of on gender, we also have to consider the dual disaster or humanitarian crisis, and how this disadvantage plays during the critical situations like pandemic and hazard situation. We also have to consider those scenario as well. So in Bangladesh, there are data, the research conducted by Center for Policy Dialogue, which is very renowned think tank organization in Bangladesh. So according to their research, around 35 percent of people they became at risk of becoming new poor. They are the new poor due to COVID pandemic. So like in the house, because of the stereotype gender role, we are expecting men to earn the money, and we are expecting women to serve the unpaid care work role. So this both of them are like under pressure because of the stereotype gender role. Like COVID has put more pressure on men to earn money, to save the life or livelihood. And for the women, the unpaid care work burden also increased. There are research which says that after the pandemic, the 50% workload has increased because of the COVID. And because women are confined in the home, and then husband, they don't have job, or their job is at risk. So both of like the family members are under mental pressure. Violences, domestic violences increased a lot. And this negative impact also, like our children are also facing so many negative impacts because of the tension of their parents because of the situation. So there are also like if we look at the women who are involved with this, like small enterprise or cottage work, some or informal worker in Bangladesh, like there are like many of the women, those are not getting any loan support or financial support from our government. The After the COVID-19, our government has provided some stimulate package for 5 million people, but those are not sufficient for the in consideration of the vulnerable people we have. Only 9% loans are available for the small enterprise, and there are no provision for women to have those stimulate package. And in the package we have in Bangladesh, which is basically ranked 22 among the South Asian countries. So this is only some liquid money to the vulnerable people, 2,500 BDT, which is also not sufficient for the people to meet their need. But even though these monies are also not available for the women, so they don't have access to money, they don't have access to loan, because for loan women have to show some asset to take the loan. So because since they don't have those assets to shows to the financial commercial bank, they are many times they are lagging behind to get those services. So some in that case, maximum time they have to depend on the informal sector to take the loans, which is also creating burden for women to survive in these pandemic situations. um, um, so I was talking about the impact of the impact on the gender, but apart from the impact of gender impact, some we are often seen women as a vulnerable, but we also have to recognize their leadership, recognize their knowledge, the frontline knowledge they have to deal with disaster. Because in Bangladesh, there are numbers of evidence where women have shown their leadership, their frontline knowledge to deal with those such disaster. Because when Oxfam has implemented some humanitarian program, what we have seen that when we involve women leaders during the humanitarian response, the response became more inclusive, more accountable, and more transparent, because they know how to address the need of the family. They know what to prioritize. But these evidence are not very common for all scenario, because their participation in planning process, designing, or implementing any kind of development program or humanitarian program is very low. We did a research during the cyclone Amphan in collaboration with UN Women when we
You have
found that.
2 seconds. Sorry,
Okay,
Mala, to interrupt, but
okay. So what we have seen that 70% of the respondents they shared that they don't have, women responded, they don't have participation in decision making. I think this is also very important to ensure women's participation in the decision making, to have more inclusive program to deal with such a disaster and dual disaster. Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank you, Mala, for taking us into the communities and into the households to see how the effect of COVID-19 has increased the inequalities that already exist among at that level. I'd like to bring in our next speaker, his name is Inamul Mazid Khan Siddiqui. He's head of the Climate Justice and Natural Resource Rights from Oxfam, Bangladesh. Inam is a development practitioner based in Bangladesh who promotes inclusiveness, rights-based approaches to natural resource governance and justice in environmental and climate actions. His current role is head of climate justice and natural resource rights. He has worked with several multi-country programs, including Transboundary Rivers of South Asia in Oxfam, as well as Mangroves for the Future initiative, IUCN. He is a member of the Social Science Working Group for the Society for Conservation Biology and trustee of Bangladesh Youth Environmental Initiative. Thank you, Iman, for joining us today. Please let us hear from you.
Let me start by sharing my screen. So today, thanks Malapa for bringing us that context of Bangladesh and other similar scenarios where we are seeing a lot of increase in violence against women. And of course, what you ended with, barriers to the decision-making process and participation of women in that. Oxfam is an organization that works across the world, basically to fight the injustice of inequality and poverty. And that's where we focus. And as I was listening to our colleague from Conservation International, he was saying that during such crises, maybe conservation organizations are not the ones who are supposed to be the first responders, but they go there in the last mile to really take those conservation actions. For an organization like Oxfam, it's the other way around. We are supposed to be the first responders on the field when in times of crisis. And when we work with those marginalized communities, we see some of the root causes of their problems related with the injustice that happens within the natural resource governance process, and unfortunately through some of our conservation actions. That's where we come in to really raise that voice of the community members when they face or they feel that they are not really getting the environmental justice that they deserve. That's where we come in. So let me talk about a specific sector as an example to really explain what that means for us when we are coming from a justice perspective with the natural resource governance or conservation in general. So I'm talking about the fisheries sector in Bangladesh and particularly capture fisheries in the country. And let's look at the general situation of fishers first before we get into the discussion around the gender dynamics of it. So first of all, let's remember that there are several legal restrictions on fishing in the country, and it's huge. For instance, if you look at special part of it, Bangladesh is not a big country. Let us remember there are 534 fish sanctuaries. Like, these are only declared in last 5 years. There were more than that before that. So the trend is increasing of more and more protected areas, marine protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, even certain below certain level of depth, fishing is prohibited. So there is huge special restriction on fishers, where they can go or where they cannot go. And on top of that, there is temporal one. So 240 days plus fishing ban only for juvenile hilsa. Then on top of that, you have 22 days fishing ban on hilsa breeding, then 65 days marine fishing ban. If you sum them up all together and add the regular low fishing season, so when you don't get enough fish, or you have a cyclone season where it's not safe to go for fishing, if you add them up all, you literally have maybe a month or maximum 2 for fishing in the entire year. And that doesn't put the fishers in a very suitable position to pursue their livelihood. There are fishing bans and gear type bans as well, like many other kinds of it. But it's becoming extreme with time. Then there is the question of special distribution of the fishing efforts. In the coastal zone, there is high fishing effort, and some of the more economically viable species like the hilsa, which is an anadromous fish, it's caught in the coastal zone mostly. And the fishers in the upstream, they are in a relatively bad position. So what happens is fishermen, they travel from those upstream areas, go down to the coastal zone to seek their livelihood. Fisherwomen, they cannot, because they have a care work burden because of the patriarchal system in the country. Which means when this is not being managed, fisherwomen are finding them in a difficult position. Now, if we look at the general income situation of the fishers, like the yellow portion, like we do regular data collection from our fisher leaders, fishermen and women. So this is a based on a time series data. If you look at the yellow portion of this pie chart, this portion of their expenditure is basically the biggest that they have to spend, and it's to repay the debt they have taken from microfinance institutions and local debt or loan sharks. It's even bigger than their food expenditure, which is the orange portion in this pie chart, if you see. And this is not like if you look at these communities, the total expenditure that they can afford to do, of course, which is based on their income, is lower than the minimum poverty line. So it's below the $1.25 poverty line for both men and women. So in general, irrespective of their gender, the fishers in the country are already in a bad situation. They have very limited and distributory barriers that they are facing due to the limitations of the natural resource governance, particularly fisheries governance. So if the generic situation is so destitute, so how is it different for the fisherwoman? Definitely there is additional barrier from the patriarchal system. And when we add the pandemic factor with it, when COVID came in, what made it worse? That's what we will try to see. So this is one of the examples. I'm really going qualitative here. I'm trying to show you some persona that might represent some of the real realities. I'm not really going to too many quantitative factors here. So this is, if you look at this example, I'm using a pseudonym, Jubaida, but the character is real. So she is from a boat resident community. So fisherwomen, they lead these families, they live their entire life in boats. They don't own lands. Traditional fisher folk, all they have is the common pool resource and the fishing. And the types of gear that they use, traditionally it's hook and line, or things like, they don't use much of a net, and they particularly fish in limited areas. They don't travel across many areas for fishing, but their rights on those particular fishing grounds is not secured. Their ethnicity is different, but it's not legally recognized. So these fisherwomen already have those issues. In addition to all the other things that I just talked about in the overall fisheries sector, these fisherwomen from the boat resident communities, they have their additional issues. The fishing areas, fishing spots that they traditionally used to harvest fish from, that's being taken over by the sand miners. And because of their position in the power structure, they cannot really fight the sand miners and other fishers or commercial fishing vessels. They cannot fight them. They have these issues, and they don't have a platform to raise their voice. That was already there before the pandemic. And as the pandemic started to reveal itself, the restrictions became more. So these communities were also not allowed to leave the shore for fishing. Why? Because we have to keep everyone safe and within a secure perimeter, perhaps. But what the cost that they were bearing, because they don't have anything else, that was not being addressed. What the restriction to me or someone who is in the city and the restriction to this same community should not be the same. The approach should be different, which was not there. So they suffered. And that also restricted them to raise their voice for the fisheries management issues that they were already facing. People like us, the civil societies, they were not being able to go to them to support their voice raising processes. And also, if we look at the mode of operation the civil society organizations have taken amid pandemic is mostly based on digital tools and technologies. And if we look at the digital divide that exists in these communities, look, you cannot really expect a community who lives in the boat to stay connected with you through Skype or Zoom. We really need to be able to travel to them and to work with them, which again exposes them to the threat of COVID. Like the interaction itself is risky for them, for us, everyone. So this is a complex situation that the COVID has brought in, and the situation was already bad before that. And if we look at like similar cases are there in Sundarban. If you look at the crabbers, someone was talking about the change in the market systems around aquaculture and fisheries products, fish products in general. So even if they are allowed, like if they can somehow bribe the police, I'm sorry to quote that, and they can go for fishing, when they go to the market to sell that fish, especially when there was a lockdown for quite a long time, they were not getting the proper price for fishes that they ought to sell. It's because it's a perishable product. When all the transport systems are dislinked because of the lockdown and everything, the perishable products prices were heavily impacted, and these fisherwomen faced that. So they were not being able to fish whatever they were being able to fish, when they were not being able to sell the proper price in the market. Same happened with the crabbers in Sundarban. The crab industry was based on exports to China, Middle East, Australia, and European Union, and all that stopped with the pandemic. And suddenly a community, especially women who were finding crabbing as a means to sustain themselves, especially after the big losses of several cyclones in that area, they could not adapt with the sudden change, and there was no insurance or any other means to protect them from these sudden changes in the market system. If we look at Jahanara Appa's case from Rajarajasha, this island got eroded just before the pandemic last year. 42,000 people, more than 50% of them women and children, they were displaced from their houses. They couldn't even settle themselves. Look at the house like that she's living in. And amid that, the pandemic hit. And this is also a fisher folk community. Jahanara herself does not fish, but her husband needs to fish if they need to survive. When we went to this island first to respond as relief providers, as what our mandate is, what they were saying that, brother, we don't really need your relief right now. If you just let me fish, that fish will provide me with more money than your relief. But look at the entire system. They're saying like, we cannot fish right now because there's a fishing ban. So they won't understand the entire bigger picture of fisheries and biodiversity conservation, because they're not liable for that. The liability lies with the big industrial development, the urbanites that we have, like for last 50, 100 years, the global development that we have done and the biodiversity cost of that. Jahanara was not responsible for that. She just lost her house, but yet our legal system does not accommodate her to have an exception, especially when she just lost everything. It's not there. And she cannot raise her voice because the pandemic is not allowing her to get connected with at least the civil societies, let alone the government systems, because being a not so rich country, we also have our limitation. Even the government cannot support them. But at the same time, the restrictions on communication and interaction between community and the civil societies that has happened, the shrinking civic space, that has also impacted Jahanara and likes of her. If we look
thank you. I have to interrupt you here. We need to move on. So if you could just wrap up quickly, please.
I think I was on my last anyway.
Okay.
Just to highlight the fact that the double whammy that we are having, the cyclone that just happened in Bangladesh and India, and all those impacting the fisherwomen and men. And let us at least keep in our mind when we have our conservation policies as civil society or knowledge makers, if we are raising our voice, let us keep in our mind the environmental justice and gender paradigms of it. And let's not worsen the situation. 12,000 people, as we are saying, could die every day from this pandemic. Let's not make it worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Inam, and I'm sorry. I apologize for interrupting the panelists, and I can see how many questions and how much information has been generated. We have one last speaker, and then we can go on to questions and answers. The last speaker is Senator retired Javed Jabbar, founding President Bahabeli, former IUC and Global Vice President, Pakistan. As founding president of Bahabeli, which is an IUC and member organization, Javed Jabbar was elected as Regional Councillor West Asia and one of the 4 global vice presidents of IUCN for 2 consecutive 4-year terms from 2004 to 2012. Senator from 1985 to 1991, he was the only member of the Parliament of Pakistan to serve on the steering committee, which formulated the National Conservation Strategy, launched in 1992, that subsequently shaped progressive policies and actions on multiple levels. Javed Jabbar is also the chairman of the Social Policy and Development Center, Karachi, co-founded with Dr. Hafiz Pasa, and SPDC has produced over 700 publications to date and is rated as one of the leading research centers and think tanks in Asia on social and economic policy. Javed Jabbar, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman Rahim. Thank you very much, Meher, for that gracious introduction. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you. Christine Walker, Panamela, thank you also, and Idza and Kame, Mahfooza Mala, and Mahal Siddiqui, and all the participants in this very important webinar. My subject is perils and prospects for CISP and IUCN. I must compliment each of the preceding speakers because they have presented in very graphic, evocative words, thoughts, and images the unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in, one that embraces all human beings on the planet. Fortunately, in a sense, of course, only a small percentage in relative terms has been infected, and yet the impact, like you say, the sum of its parts is far larger than the numbers. This is one phenomenon that has enveloped the entire planet, and over 7 billion people directly or indirectly impacted. And I think each of the preceding presentations has added to our awareness and provided some very interesting thoughts and data. One, first of all, is struck by the curious parallel phenomenon that we witness. On the one hand, an awareness, a broad general awareness about what the pandemic means, and at the same time, mass indifference. Indifference, whether in Pakistan or whether in countries like the United States or even India or elsewhere. So this curious parallel process unraveling itself, where people know that the mask is recommended. And regardless of whether you're literate or uneducated, there seems to be indifference. And that indifference partly reflects traditional, deeply entrenched biases, unwillingness to accept facts. You know what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of the United States once said it memorably: I never let the facts get in the way of my opinions. And here we are faced with irrefutable scientific evidence that this pandemic impacts all and every sector, and yet there is this refusal to acknowledge it. What are the perils that we face? Well, first of all, from a CIS point of view, I would say new pressures on members' capacity to contribute as actively in the past. I'm sure their commitment and passion has not diminished. But each CIS member is, after all, a human being, also subject to the same pressures that we are all going through. Second, the derailment of perhaps previous ongoing programs and research that you were doing before the onset of COVID-19. Have we derailed those? Have new priorities taken over? And the tendency to see COVID primarily as a health issue, even though in the preceding presentations we have seen the multiple ramifications beyond conventional health concerns, whether it is gender-based violence, whether it is livelihoods and basic survival. It is a holistic, multi-dimensional phenomenon that we need to witness and examine as part of the COVID process. And then, of course, the perennial problem, shortfalls of funding. How will CSP and IUCN maintain the momentum? Will new funding resources enable us to sustain our conventional commitment to other facets of conservation and take on this new unknown territory for research and knowledge? I was greatly both inspired and distressed by conversations I held yesterday with, for example, a woman who is one of our community partners. Incidentally, some organizations which suffer from my leadership work in both remote rural areas and also in urban areas. And yesterday I spent some considerable time speaking on the cell phone with a woman named Kamla. I wish I had her picture to share with you, and I couldn't prepare that. But look at Kamla. She looks like a very intelligent woman, of course, which she is. I've had the pleasure of meeting her in real life. She has given birth to only 5 children. She has 3 cows and 2 buffalo. They have 10 acres of land. Her husband, Raichand. They live very close to the Pakistan-India border. They're part of the 3% non-Muslim minority in a predominantly Muslim population. So they're subject to discrimination, potentially not only from us bad Muslims or good Muslims, but also from within their own caste-born system. And these are Dalits. And what does she tell me? She tells me that in this day and age of the COVID crisis, I ask her, what in your view is the single greatest problem that you think we need to address? And she says, the education of girls. It was so heartening to hear this woman, who is amongst the poorest of the poor, affirming the importance of sending girls to school, and not only just sending them, because she had to drop out after class 5, but staying there and making sure, and she did it. Her daughters all completed school. But there are today in Pakistan estimated to be 15 to 20 million children out of school. 15 to 20 million children, half of them girls, and many of them dropouts because there are not enough schools to go to after class 5. So the imperative of education, which has suffered due to COVID-19, because these remote and rural communities may not have the same rates of infection that urban areas do, but they don't have easy access to online classes, because while schools were closed for 4 to 5 months, online teaching, which we do through 2 other organizations, SOS Children's Villages and SPO, we maintain that. But in many areas, there is very poor connectivity, as we just heard from our friends in Bangladesh. So COVID-19, as was rightly said, has compounded the problem of creating and sustaining education on an emergency basis for children. There is also some good news that even in COVID-19, in a town called Larkana, which is in the northern part of this province where I live, the other organization, Baeli also, which has been working with SPO, held some very well-attended workshops for women police officials to sensitize them and their male colleagues to the perils of gender-based violence, on the increased the exponential increase, as we have heard in some countries and even in our country. So the good news is that even hardened, cynical police personnel who are not very vulnerable to sentiment or to the feminine perspective are being sensitized, and they actively and very purposefully participated in those workshops. So there is some good news. If those are the perils, what are the prospects? Well, for CESP, I think that like other commissions, CESP too is not a physical headquarter, office-oriented kind of structure. It is so beautifully virtual. It's a network. And in this day and age of the past 8 to 9 months of COVID-19, this is the kind of networking that CESP is used to, and we need to build on that. How do we take this inherent capacity for connectivity and create a new level of networking and empowerment? Previously limited to, we are not limited to a single campus. We are a global campus of people who have this extraordinary capacity for research and scholarship. And these new directions that need to be explored, already CEEP's mandate is very broad, but I think very specific new themes have been identified. And when we look at the new opportunities, do we also need to become far more robust and vigorous in advocacy? We must caution against selling to the converted. CESP is already well known in the fraternity of the conservation community and within IUCN and in related organizations. But we need to make CESP go beyond those who are already converted to reach out to new audiences, even though they may be broadly aware of our concerns. And in this, of course, we are able to use the unique structure and composition of IUCN, the only organization in the world that brings together states and NGOs, though that too comes with a problem. Because one of the phenomena that I am witnessing, not only in my country, but in other countries, is an offshoot of democracy. A democracy, even as we advocate it and we wish for it, has the poison of partisanship, party-based perspectives that can paralyze whole systems. And this is not just true for a democracy that's only a few decades old. We witness what's happening in the United States.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. At the moment I said the USA, I know you want to cut me down. Don't worry, I won't go beyond another 2 minutes. But this partisanship that prevents the processes of parliament and policy making to develop a consensus and purposeful action when it comes to putting into hard reality the concepts and the recommendations that emerge from CESP's research and from IUCN recommendations. We need to centralize the concept of gender equity and equality. And I'm not aware, pardon my ignorance, but I don't know whether CESP is vigorously enough using podcasts and non-conventional media to reach out to and make alliances with new forms of organizations that have emerged in the last 10 to 15 years. NGOs, yes. Governments, yes. But there are also, as we know, many now social media-based platforms. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to listening to participants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Javed. Thank you very much. Kristen, will you take some questions now, please?
Sure. I just wanted to thank all of the speakers. I think you all gave an excellent perspective on the importance of the issues at a global scale, the impacts that COVID is having on mental health, livelihoods, due to lockdowns, increase in violence, the issues around education, and just the issues around transportation and movement of people. I think this has been really important. And I think really, I think I was thinking about Kaim's presentation, Imam's presentation, thinking about the conservation community and the development community and how you link these pieces together. We have a number of questions that have come up in the Q&A, and I'll repeat them, and I'll try to pull some from the chat as well. A couple of them have been answered by one or two, but I'm going to put some out again. Simon Joshua asked, I think it is important to learn how to overcome challenges posted by the new normal. My question is to all presenters so far. What is our new strategies to be adopted in terms of creating awareness to help in overcoming these challenges? I know Itza answered it in the chat box, but if another panelist would like to take up that, thinking about the new normal, or is it a new normal, right? The floor is open.
I can say a couple of things, Kristen.
Sure.
Thank you. I mean, I think this has shaken the entire world and the conservation community into really recognizing how interlinked human health is with conservation, and just the knock-on effects, economic, livelihood, violence. I mean, everything is so interconnected. And I would love to see this, you know, this is a series of Build Back Better, right? So what I would love to see is that as the conservation community builds back in this new normal, that we really take a much more concerted effort to understand the social dynamics of conservation. And I mean, certainly we've evolved a lot in the last several decades, but we still have a long ways to go. Gender, as you know, gender is still relatively new to a lot of conservation practitioners and organizations. And so, yeah, I hope that would sort of be one of the good benefits of this whole pandemic, I think, was if we can build back better, and that looks like a really integrated social and environmental approach. Thanks.
Anyone else like to provide a response to the question? Itza.
Gracias. En la misma línea de Kaim.
Itza,
Yeah.
are you going to speak in Spanish? If you're going to speak in
Yes.
Spanish, you need to switch your interpretation button on the right hand to Spanish so that it will be translated into English.
Sí, estoy en español. Ya. No, nada más, bueno, quiero hablar en español para que los colegas de hispanohablantes también tengan más oportunidad. El Centro de Violencia de Género y Medio Ambiente que estamos creando en UICN es un espacio para esto. Queremos con ello ofrecer un espacio para crear una comunidad de práctica, un centro que brinde recursos, que brinde la oportunidad de colectivamente, quienes estamos interesados, todos los grupos, organizaciones, partners que trabajamos el tema ambiental y de conservación, tengamos un espacio colectivo para discutir y avanzar en estos temas. Para eso está creado el centro y lo ponemos a su disposición y les invitamos a visitarlo.
Thank you, Itza. There's another question here. Khalif would like to know from our Bangladesh speakers that in Pakistan, for men and women who are daily wage earners or shopkeepers, the lockdown has led to a loss of income. Is that the same situation in Bangladesh? And what are they doing to cope with the situation?
Actually, it's the same. The impact was huge, and it's not just because of the pandemic. We had multiple disasters over the last 9 months. It includes a big flood, one cyclone, and rapid erosion in many sites. So the impact was huge. There wasn't much response, unfortunately. We did one thing, at least from Moxam, we can say we insured about 2,000 wage earners, and it triggered a payout because the situation was bad. So some of them were insured, some of them who are covered through the government support packages got it, but others, they're just suffering. But the wage loss was huge.
Jaber?
Yeah, because the name of Pakistan was also mentioned. I just want to say, while we are, we are a huge country, we are the world's 5th most populous country now, racing to become number 4, I hope not. But even at number 5, there are millions of families that were adversely affected. And to be fair, the government has made a very valiant attempt to increase the scope of the support program for women in particular. There was an original program called the Benazir Income Support Program, which has now been retitled ESAS. And through that, several millions of households were given cash stipends through a very comprehensive verification process to avoid duplication and waste. So in the middle of this crisis, there have also been some very positive attempts to arrest the damage.
Thank you very much. So I have another question for you all, and maybe it's a little bit of a amalgamation of some of the comments I'm seeing. So, we've talked a lot about the role of conservation and the role IUCN can play, whether it's the Commission or IUCN as a large membership organization. We've heard from members here. What else can IUCN as a union do to address these issues as we look at building back better or we look at recovery? We heard from Itza about the issues of prepare, respond, and document and how we maneuver that. We heard from Kaim on how you look at better guidelines, but how you also look at referrals and bringing in those new partnerships. So I'd love to hear some of your final reflections, what you think those steps are that have to happen.
Well, shall I put my foot in my mouth first, and then others can do much better? I just want to say that I think IUCN is not yet, and I'm not passing the buck to someone. I'm part of IUCN. And I think that IUCN is currently underutilizing its unique compositional character. The only organization in the world of which states, governments, and NGOs are members. And I believe that this is a very important reason why IUCN should be persuading governments to conduct much more robust interaction with constituencies and partners within their own countries, and to eliminate the scope for contradictory policies and confusion between a central government and governments at the district and the provincial levels. Some countries may not face that problem as much as we do in our country. But I believe, to summarize, IUCN is not fully utilizing its compositional character to become more vigorously involved in policy changes and in implementation at the grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you. Itza, I noted you had your mic off, and then Imam is after.
Sí, gracias. Durante la elaboración de estos documentos que yo presenté, nos pudimos enterar que diversos miembros de la UICN ya están trabajando el tema. Ya hay diversas organizaciones, y por ejemplo lo que Kaim presentó de conservación internacional, pero también todos los mecanismos financieros climáticos tienen ya estrategias de género, y es más, el Green Climate Fund tiene y establece que se debe diseñar en cada proyecto un protocolo para abordar la violencia de género en los proyectos financiados. Entonces, quizás nos hace falta más seminarios como este, webinars como este, compartir lo que hemos avanzado, compartir lo que hemos aprendido y tomar una posición más fuerte como unión. Y estoy totalmente de acuerdo, involucrar de una manera más directa, no solo a las organizaciones, sino a los gobiernos. ¿Por qué? Porque los gobiernos, en su gran mayoría, son firmantes de todos los acuerdos internacionales que previenen la violencia de género. Entonces, pues sí, tenemos mucho camino que recorrer juntos, pero estamos empezando. Yo felicito esta iniciativa por ello.
Imam?
Yes,
Imam?
thank you. I'll just add with what Javed Bhai just said and Dr. Itza as well. So one of the compositional factors that IUCN still misses is the connection that it can establish between the marginalized grassroots voices and the government. So our members, they are not enough. There is a feminist principle that we say, nothing about us without us. So if we are talking about the communities who are impacted, who are dependent on the natural resources, and if we are taking a conservation or governance decision, these communities ought to speak for themselves. We do not carry the mandate to speak for them unless we facilitate them to speak for themselves in front of the power holders. And that's where I think IUCN has a role to play. And in the about new forms of partnership, we should reassess the membership of the commissions itself, including CISP and others, the practitioners on the ground, even if they are not considered scientists in traditional sense, how we are bringing them in the commissions and letting them enrich the global movement of conservation. And especially from an environmental justice perspective, I think that's where we might consider having a relook. Thank you. And just to clarify, I was part of IUCN Secretariat before, so I call myself, I used to work for conservation of nature, so no hard feelings.
No hard feelings taken. I want to thank you all. This was a very robust discussion, and I think a lot of recommendations have been set out. I'm going to pass to Meher to sort of wrap it up and close us out, and we will be producing a number of materials that will be on the CISP website as a result of this session. But Meher, I'll pass it back to you to close it out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kristen. I just want to say thank you to all our panelists today. Thank you very much for your perceptions, your thoughts, your experiences, your time, and sharing it all with us. And to all those who've joined us over this last 1.5 hours, we will have this on our Facebook. There will be links which you can then see it's been recorded, so you'll be able to take a look at it again. And thank you for coming in and contributing to this important topic on gender and COVID-19. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our translators, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day or evening.
Thank you.